Desert Bloom Wild. Eliza McGraw had always known her family's name carried weight, but when her father's debts came due, she never expected Beau Callahan to be the one collecting. He stood in her doorway, hat tipped low, voice dark as thunder. "Your daddy owed me," he murmured. "Now, it looks like you do too." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Debt Unpaid. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the parched earth, painting the McGraw ranch in hues of fading gold and deepening umber. Eliza McGraw stood on the weathered porch of the main house, her calloused hands gripping the worn wooden railing. The air, thick with the scent of dust and the distant promise of a dry storm, did little to soothe the knot of unease that had settled in her stomach. Her father, Thomas McGraw, had been gone for 3 days, a journey to redemption's edge that was supposed to have taken only one. He'd ridden out with a promise to settle a long-standing debt, a matter he'd kept shrouded in secrecy, even from her. Eliza, at 57, was no stranger to hardship. The frontier had a way of stripping away pretense, leaving only the raw, resilient core of a person. Her life had been a tapestry woven with threads of joy and sorrow, love and loss. Her husband, Samuel, had succumbed to a fever 15 years prior, leaving her to manage the ranch alongside her father, a task she'd embraced with the quiet strength that had become her hallmark. She'd buried her only son 10 years ago, a snake bite while he was trying to round some strays. The grief, even now, felt a phantom limb. But this waiting, this gnawing uncertainty, was a different kind of torment. Thomas had been unusually quiet in the days leading up to his departure, his usual boisterous laughter replaced by a haunted look in his eyes, a look she hadn't seen since Samuel's passing. He'd avoided her gaze, his answers to her questions vague and evasive. "Just some old business, Eliza," he'd said, his voice raspy, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his worn leather saddlebags. "Nothing for you to worry your pretty head about." Eliza snorted softly at the memory. Pretty head. As if she were still the naive young girl he'd once shielded from the harsh realities of their world. She'd seen enough sunrises and sunsets, enough births and deaths, to know that life on the frontier was anything but pretty. It was a constant battle against the elements, against the predators, both animal and human, that lurked in the shadows. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her eye, pulling her from her reverie. A lone rider, approaching at a steady pace. Her heart quickened, a flicker of hope battling against the rising tide of dread. As the rider drew closer, her hope withered. It wasn't her father. The silhouette was unfamiliar, broader, more imposing. The horse, a magnificent black stallion, moved with a controlled power that spoke of a rider who was accustomed to command. The rider reined in at the edge of the yard, dismounting with a fluid grace that belied his size. He was tall, even taller than her father, with shoulders that strained against the seams of his worn leather jacket. His face was obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but Eliza could sense the intensity of his gaze, even from this distance. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried gait of a man who was used to getting what he came for. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his eyes, the color of dark, polished obsidian, finally meeting hers. They held a depth of experience, a hint of something dangerous, that sent a shiver down her spine. He removed his hat, revealing a face that was both rugged and strikingly handsome, a face etched with the lines of a life lived hard. His hair, the color of raven's wings, was streaked with silver at the temples, framing a strong jaw and a mouth that was set in a firm, uncompromising line. This was no ordinary rancher, no friendly neighbor come to call. "Mrs. McGraw," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. It was a voice that carried the weight of the mountains, the whisper of the wind, the threat of a coming storm. Eliza straightened her shoulders, her gaze unwavering. "That's right. And you are?" He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod.
"Beaucallahan."
The name struck her like a physical blow. Callahan. The name her father had whispered in his sleep, a name laced with fear and regret. The name that had haunted her dreams for the past few nights, a premonition of the trouble that was now standing on her doorstep. "I'm here about your father," Callahan continued, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, taking in the weathered buildings, the parched fields, the silent testament to years of toil and struggle. Eliza's hand tightened on the railing. "My father is delayed." Callahan's lips curved in a smile that held no warmth, no humor. "Delayed is one word for it. Dead is another." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and numb. She'd known, deep down, that something was terribly wrong. But to hear it spoken aloud, so bluntly, so cruelly, was like a punch to the gut. How did he die?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. Callahan's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. "He died owing me a considerable debt. A debt he swore he'd repay." He paused, letting the words sink in. "He offered collateral." Eliza's mind raced. Collateral? What could her father possibly have offered as collateral? The ranch? Their meager savings? Callahan stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "He offered you." Eliza recoiled, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Offered me?" "In marriage," Callahan clarified, his voice devoid of any emotion. "To settle the debt. A binding agreement, witnessed by several associates of mine." Eliza felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This couldn't be happening. "Her father he couldn't have. I don't believe you," she said, her voice trembling, but her gaze still holding his. "My father would never." Callahan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn and yellowed with age. He unfolded it and held it out to her. "Read it for yourself, Mrs. McGraw. It's all there in black and white." His signature, plain as day. Eliza took the paper, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She scanned the document, her heart sinking with each word she read. It was a contract, a legally binding agreement, stating that in the event of Thomas McGraw's failure to repay his debt to Beau Callahan, he would offer his daughter, Eliza McGraw, in marriage. And there, at the bottom, was her father's signature, scrawled in his familiar, shaky hand. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sun, which had been setting just moments before, now seemed to blaze down with an unbearable intensity. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. She looked up at Callahan, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and despair. This is insane," she whispered. "I won't do it." Callahan's expression didn't change. "You don't have a choice, Mrs. McGraw. The debt is owed. And I intend to collect." He tipped his hat, his shadow once more engulfing her. "I'll give you the night to consider your options, though there really aren't any. I'll be back at dawn." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting with the same effortless grace he displayed earlier. He looked back at her, his dark eyes holding hers captive. "Your daddy owed me," he murmured, his voice dark as thunder, the words echoing the dread that had taken root in her soul. "Now it looks like you do too." And with that, he spurred his horse and rode off, leaving Eliza standing alone on the porch, the contract clutched in her trembling hand, the weight of her father's debt and her own uncertain future pressing down on her like the vast, unforgiving sky above. The dust he'd kicked up lingered, tasting of ash and despair. Chapter 2. Callahan's arrival, a storm bruise. The dawn arrived not with the gentle caress of sunlight, but with the bruised purple and angry gray of a brewing storm. Eliza had spent the night in a restless, dream-haunted sleep, the image of Callahan's face, his dark, unyielding eyes, burned into her mind. She'd risen before the sun, her body aching, her spirit heavy with dread. The contract, her father's damning legacy, lay on the worn wooden table beside her bed, a stark reminder of the impossible situation she found herself in. She'd made coffee, the strong, bitter brew doing little to dispel the fog of exhaustion and fear that clung to her. She'd paced the confines of the small ranch house, her mind racing, searching for a way out, a loophole, a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. But there was none. Her father, in his desperation, had bound her to a man she didn't know, a man who exuded an aura of danger and ruthlessness. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the silence, sending a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. She knew, without a doubt, that it was Callahan. She stepped out onto the porch, her hand instinctively reaching for the worn shotgun that leaned against the wall, a relic from Samuel's hunting days. She hadn't fired it in years, but the feel of the cold steel in her hand gave her a small measure of comfort, a fleeting sense of control in a situation that was spiraling out of her control. Callahan rode into the yard, his black stallion prancing slightly, sensing the tension in the air. He dismounted, his movements as deliberate and controlled as they had been the previous day. He was dressed in the same worn leather jacket, the same dark, wide-brimmed hat, but today there was something different about him. A subtle shift in his demeanor, a hint of something almost like anticipation. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Morning, Mrs. McGraw," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate with the gathering storm clouds. Eliza didn't return the greeting. She held the shotgun loosely at her side, her finger hovering near the trigger. "I told you yesterday I won't do it." Callahan's lips curved in a slight smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And I told you don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Eliza countered, her voice trembling slightly, but her gaze unwavering. "I choose not to be bound by a contract made by a desperate man." Callahan took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "Desperate men do desperate things, Mrs. McGraw. Your father knew the risks. He knew the consequences." "And what about me?" Eliza challenged. "Did he consider the consequences for me? Did he consider that I might have a life of my own, a life I'm not willing to sacrifice to pay his debts?" Callahan's expression hardened. "Your life, as you call it, is tied to this ranch, to your father's legacy. And that legacy now includes me." Eliza's grip tightened on the shotgun. "This ranch is mine. My husband and I built it, worked it, bled for it. It's not something to be bartered away like a prize heifer." "Sentimentality won't change the facts, Mrs. McGraw," Callahan said, his voice cold and sharp. "The debt is owed, and I'm here to collect." He reached into his jacket, and Eliza instinctively raised the shotgun, aiming it at his chest. Callahan paused, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect, crossing his face. "You wouldn't," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Eliza's finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't test me, Callahan. I've faced down worse than you in my life. I've buried a husband, a son. I've fought off wolves and rustlers. I'm not afraid to die. And I'm certainly not afraid to kill." Callahan studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching, assessing. He seemed to be weighing her words, her resolve, the desperation that flickered in her eyes. Finally, he slowly withdrew his hand from his jacket, empty. "I'm not here to kill you, Mrs. McGraw," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I'm here to honor an agreement. A debt of honor. A concept your father, in the end, was incapable of understanding." "Honor?" Eliza scoffed. "You call this honor? Blackmailing a woman into marriage?" "It's a harsh world, Mrs. McGraw," Callahan said, his gaze sweeping over the vast, unforgiving landscape. "And sometimes, the only way to survive is to play by its rules. Your father chose to play. He lost. And now you have to pay the price." The wind picked up, whipping Eliza's hair around her face, carrying the scent of dust and rain. The sky above had darkened considerably, the storm clouds gathering like a shroud. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. "I won't marry you," Eliza repeated, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "I'd rather die." Callahan's eyes held hers, a silent battle of wills raging between them. "Then you'll die," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "But the debt will still be owed. And I'll take this ranch, everything you claim to hold dear. Your choice." He turned and walked back to his horse, leaving Eliza standing on the porch, the shotgun still clutched in her hands, the weight of his words pressing down on her like the gathering storm. She watched him as he mounted, his silhouette a dark, imposing figure against the backdrop of the turbulent sky. He looked back at her, his eyes like chips of obsidian, cold and unyielding. "I'll give you until sundown," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. "Make your choice, Mrs. McGraw. Life or death. Either way, the debt will be paid." He spurred his horse and rode off, disappearing into the swirling dust and the gathering gloom. Eliza lowered the shotgun, her arms aching, her body trembling. The storm broke, the first fat drops of rain splattering on the parched earth, mingling with the tears that streamed down her face. She was trapped, caught between a rock and a hard place, between a man she despised and a future she couldn't bear to contemplate. The storm raged around her, mirroring the tempest that raged within her heart. Sundown. She had until sundown to make an impossible choice. A choice that would determine not only her fate, but the fate of everything she held dear. The distant rumble of thunder seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of the storm that Callahan had brought into her life, a storm that threatened to consume her. Chapter 3. Terms of a Cruel Bargain. The rain fell in sheets, turning the yard into a muddy quagmire. Eliza retreated inside, the shotgun still clutched in her hand, a cold, heavy weight against her palm. She placed it back in its usual spot, the familiar action providing a small, fleeting sense of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. The contract, still lying on the table, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a constant reminder of the cruel bargain that had been struck. She sank into a worn armchair, her body exhausted, her mind numb. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee, the rain lashing against the windows. It was a fitting backdrop to the turmoil that raged within her. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of the storm, the image of Callahan's face, the weight of his words. But it was no use. He was there, in her mind, in her heart, a dark, inescapable presence. She thought of her father, of the man he had been, the man he had become. She remembered his laughter, his strength, his unwavering love for her and Samuel. But she also remembered the shadows that had crept into his eyes in recent years, the secrets he had kept hidden, the desperation that had ultimately led him to this betrayal. She thought of Samuel, her beloved husband, the man who had shared her dreams, her hopes, her life. She remembered his gentle touch, his warm smile, his unwavering support. She wondered what he would have done, what he would have said if he were here now. Would he have fought? Would he have surrendered? Would he have found a way out, a way to save her from this nightmare? The hours crawled by, each one an agonizing eternity. Eliza paced the small house, her mind racing, her heart aching. She considered her options, or rather, the lack of them. She could run, but where would she go? She was too old, too tired, to start a new life. And besides, Callahan would find her. He was a man who got what he wanted, a man who wouldn't let a little thing like a runaway bride stand in his way. She could fight, but how? She was one woman, alone, against a man who clearly had resources, connections, power. The shotgun was a deterrent, perhaps, but it wouldn't be enough. She was no match for him, not in the long run. She could surrender, accept the terms of the contract, marry Callahan, and become his property. The thought made her stomach churn. She'd rather die. But then, what about the ranch? What about the legacy she and Samuel had built? What about the memories that were etched into every board, every stone, every blade of grass? Could she simply abandon it all, let it fall into the hands of a stranger, a man who cared nothing for it, a man who only saw it as a means to an end? As the afternoon wore on, the storm began to subside. The rain softened to a drizzle, the wind died down, and the clouds began to break, revealing patches of pale blue sky. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the wet landscape, creating a scene of almost ethereal beauty. But Eliza found no solace in it. The beauty only served to highlight the ugliness of her situation, the stark contrast between the world outside and the turmoil within. She heard the sound of hoofbeats again, and her heart clenched. He was back. She stepped out onto the porch, her hand instinctively reaching for the shotgun. But then she stopped. What was the point? She knew she couldn't win. Not this way. She was tired of fighting, tired of running, tired of being afraid. Callahan rode into the yard, his black stallion gleaming in the fading light. He dismounted, his movements as fluid and graceful as ever. He was still wearing the same clothes, but he looked different. The harshness in his eyes had softened, replaced by something almost like regret. He stopped a few feet from the porch, his gaze meeting hers. "Have you made your decision, Mrs. McGraw?" he asked, his voice low and even. Eliza took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I have," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Callahan waited, his expression unreadable. "I won't marry you," she said, the words echoing in the stillness. "But I will offer you a different bargain." Callahan's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "A bargain?" "Yes," Eliza said. "I'll work off my father's debt. I'll work this ranch every day until the debt is paid in full. I'll give you every penny I earn, every ounce of my strength, every drop of my sweat. But I won't be your wife." Callahan studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching, assessing. "And how long do you think that will take, Mrs. McGraw?" he asked. "To pay off a debt of that magnitude?" "I don't know," Eliza admitted. "Years, perhaps. Maybe the rest of my life. But I'll do it. I swear I will." Callahan's lips curved in a slight smile, a smile that held a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. "You're a stubborn woman, Eliza McGraw." "I am," Eliza agreed. "And I'm not afraid of hard work. I've been working this ranch my whole life. I know its worth. I know what it takes to make it thrive." Callahan nodded slowly. "I can see that," he said. "But there's more to it than just hard work, Mrs. McGraw. There's the matter of protection. This is a dangerous land. There are rustlers, outlaws, wild animals. You're a woman alone. You need someone to watch your back." "I've managed so far," Eliza countered. "So far," Callahan repeated. "But things change. The world changes. And you need to change with it." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, taking in the improvements, the signs of her and her husband's hard work over the years. "I'll make you a counteroffer," he said, his voice firm. "I'll agree to your terms. You'll work off the debt. But I'll stay here. I'll help you run the ranch. I'll protect you. I'll make sure you're safe." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "And in return you'll give me a chance. A chance to prove that I'm not the monster you think I am." Eliza stared at him, her mind reeling. This wasn't what she had expected. She had expected him to refuse, to demand his pound of flesh, to force her into marriage. But he was offering her a compromise? A partnership? "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do that?" Callahan's eyes held hers, a depth of emotion swirling within them. "Because," he said, his voice low and husky, "I see something in you, Eliza McGraw. Something I haven't seen in a long time. Something worth fighting for." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek, his fingers brushing against a stray strand of her hair. The touch, though fleeting, sent a shiver down her spine. "Give me a chance, Eliza," he whispered. "Let me prove myself to you." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, purple, and red. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle chirping of crickets. Eliza looked at Callahan, at his rugged face, his dark, intense eyes, the hint of vulnerability that flickered beneath the surface. She saw a man who was haunted by his past, a man who was searching for something, just as she was. She saw a chance, a glimmer of hope, in the midst of the darkness. And, against her better judgment, against all the fear and doubt that still lingered in her heart, she found herself nodding. Chapter 4. Eliza's stand, a glimmer of defiance. The agreement, unspoken yet solidified by a shared look of understanding, hung heavy in the twilight air. Eliza felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation. She had avoided the immediate threat of marriage, but she had also invited a dangerous, unknown element into her life. Beau Callahan, the debt collector, was now her partner? The word felt foreign, awkward, on her tongue. "We'll start at dawn," Callahan said, breaking the silence. His voice was firm, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, a hint of something that might have been respect. "We'll inventory the stock, check the fences, assess the water situation. There's a lot to be done." Eliza nodded, her mind already racing, cataloging the endless tasks that awaited them. The ranch, her life's work, was now a shared burden, a shared responsibility. She felt a flicker of resentment, a pang of loss for the independence she had so fiercely guarded. But she also felt a flicker of something else, a spark of challenge, a rekindling of the spirit that had kept her going through years of hardship. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Callahan," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. "But I have conditions of my own." Callahan raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Conditions?" "Yes," Eliza said. "This is still my ranch. My home. I won't be treated like a hired hand. We'll work together as equals. We'll share the decisions, the responsibilities, the profits and the losses." Callahan studied her for a moment, his gaze intense.
"Fair enough," he said.
"But I have a condition of my own." Eliza braced herself. "And what's that?" "We'll be honest with each other," Callahan said. "No more secrets. No more lies. We'll lay everything out on the table, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll build this partnership on a foundation of trust, or it won't work." Eliza hesitated.
Trust.
It was a precious commodity, something she hadn't given freely to anyone since Samuel's death. And to trust Callahan, a man who had arrived on her doorstep with a contract demanding her hand in marriage, it seemed almost impossible. But she also knew that he was right. Without trust, their arrangement would be nothing more than a fragile truce, destined to crumble under the weight of suspicion and resentment. "Agreed," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor of uncertainty in her heart. Callahan nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips.
"Good.
Then we have a deal." He extended his hand, and Eliza, after a moment's hesitation, took it. His grip was strong, firm, but surprisingly gentle. His hand was calloused, like hers, a testament to a life of hard work. A spark of something unexpected passed between them, a fleeting connection that sent a shiver down her spine. "I'll bunk in the old line shack," Callahan said, releasing her hand. "It's seen better days, but it'll do for now." Eliza nodded. The line shack was a small, dilapidated cabin on the far edge of the property, used by ranch hands in the old days. It was miles from the main house, a distance that provided a small measure of comfort, a buffer zone between her and the man who had so abruptly entered her life. "I'll leave some supplies for you," Eliza said, her voice a little shaky. "Food, blankets, whatever you need." "I appreciate that," Callahan said. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. "Eliza," he said, her name sounding strangely unfamiliar, yet strangely intimate on his tongue. "I know this isn't how you wanted things to be, but I promise you, I'll do my best to make this work, to earn your trust, to make amends for my part in all this." And with that, he turned and walked towards the line shack, his silhouette disappearing into the gathering darkness. Eliza watched him go, her heart filled with a confusing mix of emotions. Fear, resentment, uncertainty, but also, perhaps, a glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, this strange, unexpected partnership could be something more than just a debt paid. Maybe it could be a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to heal, to find a purpose, a connection, in a world that had seemed so bleak and empty just hours before. The first stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky, their light a faint, distant promise. Eliza took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. She had made her stand. She had defied Callahan in her own way. She had set the terms, drawn the lines. Now, all she could do was wait and see if he would honor them. If he would prove himself to be a man of his word. If he would be the partner she so desperately needed, or the enemy she so deeply feared. The night was quiet, still, but within her heart, the storm still raged, a silent battle between hope and despair, between fear and the faint, flickering embers of a long-dormant desire. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Eliza felt a spark of something akin to anticipation. The feeling was unfamiliar, unsettling, but not entirely unwelcome. It was a sign that she was still alive, still fighting, still capable of feeling something other than grief and resignation. And that, in itself, was a victory. Chapter 5. The Whispers of Redemption's Edge. The next few days settled into a rhythm, a tentative dance between two wary souls navigating unfamiliar territory. Eliza and Callahan worked side by side, their days filled with the demanding routine of ranch life. They mended fences, checked on the dwindling herd of cattle, repaired the dilapidated barn, and wrestled with the ever-present challenge of finding enough water in the arid landscape. Callahan was a surprisingly skilled rancher. He moved with an easy confidence, his hands sure and strong, his knowledge of livestock and land management evident in every task he undertook. He was a hard worker, tireless and uncomplaining, often rising before dawn and working long after sunset. He was also a man of few words, his conversations mostly limited to the practicalities of the work at hand. Eliza, in turn, found herself observing him, studying him, trying to decipher the enigma that was Beau Callahan. She watched the way he handled the horses, his touch gentle yet firm, his voice a low murmur that seemed to calm even the most skittish animals. She watched the way he surveyed the land, his eyes narrowed, assessing the subtle shifts in the terrain, the signs of drought, the distant threat of predators. She saw the lines of weariness etched on his face, the shadows that haunted his eyes, the hints of a past that he kept carefully guarded. Slowly, grudgingly, Eliza began to see beyond the debt collector, beyond the man who had threatened to take everything from her. She saw a man who was capable, resourceful, and surprisingly gentle. She saw a man who was carrying his own burdens, his own secrets, his own regrets. One evening, after a long day spent repairing a section of broken fence line, they sat on the porch of the main house, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The silence between them was comfortable, not strained, a testament to the growing ease that had developed between them. "You know this land," Eliza said, breaking the silence. "You know how to work it." Callahan nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I've spent my life on ranches," he said. "Some bigger, some smaller. Some better, some worse." "But you're not a rancher," Eliza said, more a statement than a question. Callahan's lips curved in a slight smile, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not anymore," he said. "I've worn a few different hats in my time." Eliza sensed a story there, a story he wasn't ready to tell. She didn't push him. Instead, she asked, "What brought you to Redemption's Edge?" The name of the town, the place where her father had met his end, hung heavy in the air. Callahan's expression darkened, his eyes clouding over with a shadow of something that looked like pain. "It's a town with a reputation," he said, his voice low and guarded. "A place where people go to disappear, to start over, to escape their past. Or to meet their fate," Eliza added, her voice barely a whisper. Callahan nodded. "That too," he said. "It's a town of secrets, Eliza. A town where the line between right and wrong is often blurred. A town where debts are collected, one way or another." "And my father, he got caught up in those secrets?" Eliza asked, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and anger. Callahan hesitated. "He did," he said. "He made some bad choices. He got in over his head. He owed money to some dangerous people. And you were one of them?" Eliza challenged, her gaze searching his. Callahan's eyes met hers, a flicker of something that might have been guilt crossing his face. "I was an intermediary," he said. "A collector. I enforced the rules. I made sure the debts were paid. And now you're here," Eliza said, her voice flat. "Collecting his last debt." "No," Callahan said, his voice firm. "I'm here to make amends. To do things differently. To build something, instead of destroying it." Eliza studied him, her gaze unwavering. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that he was sincere, that he was truly trying to change. But the doubt still lingered, a whisper of suspicion in the back of her mind. Redemption's Edge, she said, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. It's a fitting name, isn't it? A place where people seek redemption or find damnation. Callahan nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. It is, he said. And sometimes, it's hard to tell the difference. He stood up, his silhouette a dark, imposing figure against the fading light. I'm going to check on the horses, he said. I'll be back later. Eliza watched him go, her heart filled with a confusing mix of emotions. She was drawn to him, to his strength, his quiet competence, his hidden vulnerability. But she was also wary of him, of his past, of the secrets he still held close, of the danger that seemed to cling to him like a shadow. As she sat there alone on the porch, the whispers of Redemption's Edge seemed to swirl around her, carried on the night wind. Whispers of betrayal, of violence, of lost hopes and broken dreams. Whispers of a past that refused to stay buried, a past that threatened to engulf her and Callahan in its darkness. She knew that she was walking a dangerous path, that she was playing with fire. But she also knew that she couldn't turn back. She had made her choice. She had chosen to trust him, to give him a chance. And now, she had to face the consequences, whatever they might be. The night was filled with unanswered questions, with uncertainties, with the faint, lingering scent of danger. But beneath it all, there was a flicker of something else, a spark of hope, a whisper of possibility, a hint of a future that might, just might, be worth fighting for. Chapter 6. Secrets Etched in the Desert Wind. The following week brought a relentless heat wave, the sun beating down mercilessly on the parched land. The water sources, already low, began to dwindle further, threatening the already struggling cattle. Eliza and Callahan worked tirelessly, moving the herd to higher ground, searching for any remaining pockets of water, their efforts fueled by a growing sense of urgency. The shared hardship, the constant struggle against the elements, forged a bond between them, a silent understanding that transcended their initial animosity. They worked as a team, their movements synchronized, their communication often reduced to a few terse words or a knowing glance. Eliza found herself relying on Callahan, trusting his judgment, his instincts, his strength. One afternoon, while they were resting in the shade of a towering mesa, Eliza noticed a small, intricately carved wooden box tucked away in Callahan's saddlebag. It was old, weathered, the wood worn smooth with age, but the carvings, depicting scenes of horses and riders, were still visible, hinting at a story, a history, a life beyond the one he now lived. "What's that?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. Callahan's hand instinctively went to the box, his fingers tracing the carvings. He hesitated, a shadow crossing his face. "It's just an old keepsake," he said, his voice evasive. Eliza sensed a secret there, a piece of his past that he was reluctant to share. She didn't push him, but the box remained in her mind, a tangible symbol of the hidden depths that lay beneath his rugged exterior. Later that evening, as they were sitting by a small campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on their faces, Callahan finally spoke. "It belonged to my father," he said, his voice low and husky. "He was a horse breeder, a good man, a man of honor." Eliza listened, her heart aching for the unspoken pain in his voice. "He taught me everything I know about horses," Callahan continued. "He taught me about respect, about loyalty, about responsibility." He paused, his gaze fixed on the flames.
"But he also made mistakes," he said.
"He trusted the wrong people. He got involved in things he shouldn't have." Eliza sensed a connection there, a parallel between Callahan's father and her own. Both men had made mistakes. Both men had paid the price. "What happened?" she asked softly. Callahan's jaw tightened. "He was killed," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Murdered. By the same people he owed money to." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She understood now. The source of his darkness, his bitterness, his drive to collect debts. It wasn't just about the money. It was about revenge. It was about justice. It was about redemption. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. Callahan nodded, his gaze still fixed on the flames. "It was a long time ago," he said, "but it had changed me. It made me hard, cynical. I lost faith in people, and in everything." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and vulnerability. "Until I met you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. A feeling of connection, of understanding, of something more. "You're not like them, Eliza," Callahan continued. "You're different. You're strong, resilient, honest. You have a goodness in you that I thought had been extinguished from this world." Eliza felt her cheeks flush, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say. She was drawn to him, to his vulnerability, to the pain that he so carefully concealed. But she was also afraid of opening her heart, afraid of getting hurt, afraid of repeating the mistakes of the past. The silence was filled by the sound of coyotes and crickets. He reached out, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm, gentle, sending a shiver down her spine. "I know I have a lot to atone for," he said, his voice husky. "I know I have to earn your trust. But I'm trying, Eliza. I'm trying to be a better man." The desert wind seemed to carry the truth, and she believed it, in that moment at least. Eliza looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw the sincerity in his gaze, the vulnerability, the hope. And she knew that she couldn't deny him. She couldn't deny herself. "I know," she said, her voice soft, her hand squeezing his. "And I appreciate that." The moment hung between them, fragile, precious, filled with unspoken emotions. The fire crackled, the stars shone brightly above, and the desert wind whispered secrets of the past and perhaps promises of the future. The secrets etched on the wooden box, the secrets etched in Callahan's heart, were slowly, gradually, being revealed. And with each revelation, the bond between them deepened, the trust grew stronger, and the possibility of something more, something beautiful, something enduring, bloomed in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of their lives. The night held a promise, a fragile hope, carried on the desert wind, a whisper of redemption, not just for Callahan, but for Eliza as well. Chapter 7. A dance of distrust and desire. The days that followed were a delicate dance, a careful negotiation between two souls scarred by the past, drawn together by circumstance, and increasingly, by something more. Eliza found herself watching Callahan, her gaze lingering on the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. There was a growing warmth in his eyes, a tenderness that belied his rugged exterior. She caught herself thinking about him, wondering about his past, his dreams, his fears. She found herself wanting to know him, to understand him, to reach out to him. But she also held back, a part of her still wary, still guarded, still afraid of opening her heart to a man who had once been her enemy. Callahan, in turn, seemed to be walking on eggshells around her, careful not to overstep, careful not to push too hard. He was respectful, considerate, almost deferential. He continued to work tirelessly on the ranch, his efforts a tangible demonstration of his commitment to their partnership, his desire to earn her trust. One afternoon, while they were riding back to the main house after checking on the cattle, a sudden storm blew in, a fierce, unexpected squall that sent them scrambling for cover. They found shelter in a small, abandoned cave, a hidden recess in the side of a mesa. The rain lashed down outside, the wind howling like a banshee, trapping them in the close confines of the cave. They huddled together, their bodies close, their shoulders touching. Eliza could feel the warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart, the scent of leather and sweat, and something uniquely him. She was acutely aware of his presence, of his proximity, of the unspoken tension that simmered between them. "This reminds me of a storm I got caught in once," Callahan said, his voice low and rumbling, breaking the silence. "Back in Montana." I was just a kid, riding with my father. We got caught in a blizzard, worse than this. We thought we were going to die. Eliza looked at him, her eyes searching his. What happened? We found shelter, Callahan said. A small cabin, abandoned like this cave. We huddled together, shared what little food we had, and waited it out. It was terrifying, but it also brought us closer. We learned to rely on each other, to trust each other, to survive. Eliza sensed a parallel there, a connection between that long-ago storm and their current situation. They were trapped, not just by the weather, but by their circumstances, by their pasts, by the unspoken emotions that swirled between them. My father used to say that storms, they test you, Eliza said, her voice soft. They show you what you're made of. They reveal your strengths and your weaknesses. Callahan nodded, his gaze meeting hers.
He was a wise man, he said.
The rain continued to fall, the thunder rumbling in the distance. The air in the cave was thick with humidity, with the scent of damp earth, with the unspoken tension between them. Callahan reached out, his hand brushing against hers. His touch was tentative, hesitant, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her.
She didn't pull away.
Eliza, he said, his voice husky, his eyes searching hers. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to her lips. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was going to say, what he was going to do. And she didn't stop him. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a wave of warmth through her. It was a kiss of longing, of desire, of hope. It was a kiss that acknowledged the unspoken feelings that had been growing between them, the feelings that they had both been trying to deny, to ignore, to suppress. Eliza responded, her lips parting slightly, her hand reaching up to touch his face. His skin was rough, weathered, but his touch was gentle, tender. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense, a release of the pent-up emotions that had been simmering between them. But then, suddenly, Eliza pulled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was overwhelmed, confused, her mind racing. This was too much, too soon. She wasn't ready for this. She was still afraid, still uncertain, still haunted by the past. I can't, she said, her voice trembling.
I'm sorry.
Callahan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. It's okay, he said, his voice soft. I understand. I shouldn't have. He backed away, creating some space between them. The silence returned, but it was no longer comfortable. It was strained, awkward, filled with unspoken regrets. The storm began to subside, the rain softening to a drizzle, the wind dying down. The clouds began to break, revealing patches of pale blue sky. The sun peeked through, casting a golden glow over the wet landscape. They emerged from the cave, their clothes damp, their faces flushed, their hearts pounding. The world outside seemed different, changed, transformed by the storm and by the kiss. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the unspoken tension still hanging heavy between them. The dance of distrust and desire had taken a new turn, a step forward, and then a step back. The future was uncertain, the path ahead unclear. But one thing was certain. The kiss had changed everything. It had broken down a barrier, opened a door, unleashed a flood of emotions that could no longer be ignored. The storm had passed, but the tempest within their hearts was just beginning. The silence held its breath, waiting. Chapter 8. The Price of Freedom, A Heart's Cost. The aftermath of the kiss hung heavy in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of the shifting dynamics between Eliza and Callahan. They returned to their work, the familiar routine a welcome distraction from the turbulent emotions that churned beneath the surface. But the silence between them was different now, charged with a new awareness, a heightened sensitivity. Eliza found herself avoiding Callahan's gaze, her cheeks flushing whenever their eyes met. She was confused, flustered, her heart a chaotic mix of desire and trepidation. She had wanted the kiss, she had responded to it, but she was also terrified of the implications, of the vulnerability, of the potential for pain. Callahan, in turn, seemed to be giving her space, respecting her need for distance, for time to process what had happened. He was attentive, considerate, but there was a new cautiousness in his demeanor, a hesitancy that mirrored her own. A few days later, a letter arrived from Redemption's Edge, addressed to Eliza. It was from Sheriff Thompson, a man she knew only by reputation, a man rumored to be as corrupt as the town itself. The letter was brief, curt, demanding her presence in town to discuss matters pertaining to the late Thomas McGraw's estate. Eliza's heart sank. She knew this was trouble. She knew that the sheriff's interest in her father's estate was likely tied to the debt, to Callahan, to the tangled web of secrets that surrounded Redemption's Edge. She showed the letter to Callahan, her hand trembling slightly. He read it, his expression hardening, his eyes darkening with anger. "He's fishing," Callahan said, his voice low and dangerous. "He's trying to see what he can get away with. He knows about the debt, about the agreement. He's looking for an angle, a way to exploit the situation." "What should I do?" Eliza asked, her voice filled with anxiety. "You'll go," Callahan said, his voice firm. "But you won't go alone. I'll go with you. We'll face him together." Eliza hesitated. She didn't want to involve Callahan, to drag him further into the mess that her father had created. But she also knew that she couldn't face the sheriff alone. She needed his strength, his support, his protection. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This could be dangerous." Callahan's lips curved in a slight smile, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Danger is my middle name, Eliza," he said. "Besides, I have a score to settle with Thompson myself." Eliza sensed a story there, another piece of Callahan's past, another secret waiting to be revealed. But she didn't press him. She trusted him, instinctively, to protect her, to guide her, to be there for her. They rode for 2 days straight. They arrived in Redemption's Edge under the cover of darkness, the town a shadowy silhouette against the vast, starlit sky. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and something sinister. The saloons were brightly lit, the sounds of raucous laughter and drunken brawls spilling out into the streets. The town felt alive, but in a dangerous, unsettling way. They found a small, relatively quiet hotel on the edge of town, securing 2 rooms, a small concession to propriety, a fragile attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy in this chaotic, lawless place. The next morning, they went to the sheriff's office, a small, dilapidated building that reeked of stale tobacco and unwashed bodies. Sheriff Thompson was a large, imposing man with a fleshy face, a cruel mouth, and eyes that were as cold and sharp as shards of glass. He greeted Eliza with a sneer, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. McGraw," he said, his voice oily and smooth. "I've been expecting you." He gestured to a chair, and Eliza sat down, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. Callahan stood beside her, his presence a silent, but powerful, statement of support. "I understand your father left quite a mess behind," Thompson said, his eyes flicking to Callahan. "Debts, unpaid taxes, a ranch that's seen better days. My father's affairs are my own," Eliza said, her voice firm, despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. "I'm here to settle any outstanding debts, legally and fairly." Thompson chuckled, a sound that held no humor. "Legally and fairly?" he said. "In Redemption's Edge? That's a novel concept, Mrs. McGraw." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I understand there was an agreement between your father and Mr. Callahan here," he said, his voice dripping with insinuation. "An agreement involving you." Eliza felt her cheeks flush, her anger rising. "That agreement is no longer valid," she said. "Mr. Callahan and I have come to a different arrangement." Thompson raised an eyebrow, his eyes flicking to Callahan again. "Indeed?" he said. "And what arrangement is that?" "We're partners," Callahan said, his voice cold and hard. "We're working together to run the ranch, to pay off the debt. It's a private matter, Sheriff. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." Thompson studied them for a long moment, his gaze assessing, calculating. "Perhaps," he said. "But I have a vested interest in seeing that all debts in this town are paid, one way or another." He paused, his gaze lingering on Eliza. "And I have a feeling, Mrs. McGraw," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "that your arrangement with Mr. Callahan might not be as permanent as you think." He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'll be watching you, Mrs. McGraw," he said. "Both of you. And if I find any discrepancies, any violations of the law, I won't hesitate to take action." He gave them a final, menacing look, then turned and walked away, leaving them standing in the silence of his office. The price of freedom, Eliza realized, was not just measured in dollars and cents. It was measured in trust, in courage, in the willingness to fight for what you believed in. And sometimes, the cost was a piece of your heart. The encounter had shaken her, but it had also strengthened her resolve. She would not be intimidated. She would not be bullied. She would not surrender. She had Callahan by her side, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sheriff's threats hung in the air, a dark cloud on the horizon, but Eliza felt a flicker of defiance, a spark of hope, amidst the fear. She was not alone, and that, she realized, made all the difference. Chapter 9. Echoes of Betrayal in the Canyon's Embrace. Leaving the sheriff's office, the oppressive atmosphere of Redemption's Edge seemed to cling to Eliza, a suffocating reminder of the town's corruption and her father's tragic entanglement. Callahan, sensing her unease, suggested they leave immediately, returning to the relative safety and familiarity of the ranch. As they rode out of town, the silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Eliza felt a knot of tension in her stomach, a lingering sense of dread that she couldn't shake off. "He's not going to let it go," she said, breaking the silence. "Thompson. He's going to keep looking for a way to get his hands on the ranch." Callahan nodded, his expression grim.
"I know," he said. "He's a snake."
"He'll strike when you least expect it. What can we do?" Eliza asked, her voice filled with anxiety. "We'll be ready for him," Callahan said, his voice firm, resolute. "We'll protect the ranch. We'll protect each other." His words, meant to be reassuring, sent a shiver down Eliza's spine. She trusted Callahan, she relied on him, but she also knew that he had a past, a history, that was intertwined with the very dangers they were facing. As they rode deeper into the canyon lands, the landscape shifting from dusty plains to towering mesas and rugged rock formations, Callahan suddenly reined in his horse. "What is it?" Eliza asked, her heart quickening. Callahan's gaze was fixed on a narrow trail that wound its way up into the hills, a trail that was barely visible, almost hidden from view. "I know this place," he said, his voice low and hushed. "It's called Echo Canyon. It's a place where people used to meet. Secretly." Eliza felt a prickle of unease. "What kind of people?" Callahan hesitated. "Outlaws," he said. "Rustlers. Smugglers. People who had something to hide." He looked at Eliza, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and something else. Something that looked like regret. "I used to come here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A long time ago. With my father's associates." Eliza's heart sank. She knew, instinctively, that this was another piece of his past, another secret that was about to be revealed. "What were you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Callahan's jaw tightened. "We were making deals," he said. "Trading stolen goods. Planning robberies. Doing things I'm not proud of." Eliza felt a wave of disappointment, of disillusionment. She had started to trust him, to believe in him, to care for him. But this was a reminder of the darkness that still lingered within him, the darkness that he had tried to escape, but that still haunted him. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "You said you were just a collector. An intermediary." Callahan's eyes met hers, a flicker of pain crossing his face.
"That's what I told you," he said.
"It was easier. Less shameful." He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground. "The truth is," he said, his voice low and rough, "I was more involved than that. I was one of them. I rode with them. I participated in their crimes." Eliza felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had suspected, she had feared, But to hear it confirmed, to hear him admit it was like a punch to the gut. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Callahan looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw, aching vulnerability. "Because I can't keep lying to you, Eliza," he said. "Not anymore. I care about you. Too much to keep deceiving you." He reached out, his hand touching hers. His touch was warm, gentle, but Eliza recoiled, pulling her hand away. "I don't know if I can trust you, Callahan," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can forgive you." Callahan's face fell, his eyes clouding over with pain. "I understand," he said, his voice barely audible. "I wouldn't blame you." He turned his horse, preparing to ride away. Eliza watched him, her heart aching, her mind in turmoil. She was torn, ripped apart by conflicting emotions. She was angry, hurt, betrayed. But she also felt something else. Something that she couldn't deny, couldn't ignore. She still cared for him. She still saw the goodness in him, the potential for redemption, the man he was trying to become. "Wait," she said, her voice catching in her throat. Callahan stopped, looking back at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Eliza took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Tell me everything," she said. "Tell me the whole story. No more secrets. No more lies. Tell me everything that happened in this canyon. Tell me everything that happened in your past." Callahan hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He saw the pain in her eyes, the doubt, the fear. But he also saw something else, a flicker of understanding, a glimmer of compassion, a willingness to listen. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I will." He dismounted, and Eliza did the same. They sat together on a large, flat rock, overlooking the vast expanse of the canyon. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the rugged landscape. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, purple, and red, Callahan began to tell his story. A story of betrayal, of violence, of loss, of guilt, and of the long, arduous journey towards redemption. A story that echoed through the canyon, a story that would forever change the course of their lives. The canyon held its breath, the wind carrying the whispers of the past, the echoes of betrayal, and the faint, fragile hope of a new beginning. The truth, raw and painful, was finally out in the open, a burden shared, a wound exposed, a step towards healing. Chapter 10. Broken Oaths and Shattered Dreams. Callahan's voice, low and gravelly, filled the twilight stillness of Echo Canyon. He spoke of his youth, a time when his father, a respected horse breeder, had fallen on hard times. Desperate to save his ranch, he'd made deals with unscrupulous men, men who operated on the fringes of the law, men who frequented redemption's edge. He thought he could control them, Callahan said, his voice laced with bitterness. He thought he could play their game and win. He was wrong. The men, led by a ruthless outlaw named Silas Blackwood, had slowly tightened their grip on Callahan's father, drawing him deeper and deeper into their web of crime. They used the ranch as a front for their illegal activities, smuggling stolen goods, hiding outlaws, and laundering money. "I was young," Callahan said, his eyes filled with a haunted look. "Barely a man. I idolized my father. I wanted to be like him. I wanted to help him. He'd started by running errands, carrying messages, acting as a lookout. Gradually, he'd become more involved, participating in the robberies, the rustling, the violence. He'd convinced himself that he was doing it for his family, for the ranch, for his father. But deep down, he knew he was on the wrong path, that he was losing himself, that he was becoming one of them. There was one job," Callahan said, his voice shaking slightly. "A stagecoach robbery. It was supposed to be easy. No one was supposed to get hurt. But things had gone wrong. The stagecoach driver had resisted, a shot had been fired, and a young woman, a passenger, had been killed. Callahan hadn't pulled the trigger, but he'd been there, he'd been a part of it, he'd been responsible. That was the turning point," Callahan said, his voice filled with anguish. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live with the guilt, the shame, the blood on my hands. He'd tried to break away, to leave the gang, to start a new life. But Silas Blackwood wouldn't let him go. He threatened Callahan's father, his family, his life. He said I owed him, Callahan said, his voice bitter. He said I was in too deep. He said I was his. Callahan had been trapped, caught between his loyalty to his father and his own conscience, between his desire for freedom and the fear of retribution. He'd continued to ride with the gang, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd become withdrawn, sullen, haunted by the ghosts of his past. Then one night, everything had changed. There had been another robbery, another betrayal, another death. This time, it was Callahan's father who had been killed, murdered by Silas Blackwood himself. He said it was an accident, Callahan said, his voice choked with emotion. But I knew it was a lie. He killed him to silence him, to make sure he wouldn't talk,
To control me.
Callahan had snapped. He'd turned on Blackwood, on the gang, on everything he'd become. He'd fought them, killed some of them, escaped into the wilderness. He'd become a fugitive, a hunted man, with a price on his head. He'd spent years wandering, drifting, trying to outrun his past, trying to find redemption. He'd changed his name, taken on different jobs, tried to start over. But the ghosts had always followed him, the memories, the guilt, the shame. He'd eventually become a debt collector, a way to use his skills, his knowledge of the underworld, to make amends in his own way. He tracked down outlaws, recovered stolen goods, helped those who had been wronged. But it had never been enough. He'd never been able to forgive himself, to escape the darkness that clung to him. And then I met your father, Callahan said, his voice low and heavy. He reminded me of my own. Desperate, foolish, caught in a trap of his own making. He tried to help Thomas McGraw, to warn him, to get him out of trouble. But it had been too late. Thomas had been too deeply involved, too deeply in debt, too afraid. I didn't want to collect from you, Eliza, Callahan said, his eyes meeting hers. I didn't want it to hurt you.
But I had to.
I had to finish it. To close the circle. Eliza listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the burden he had carried. She understood now, the source of his darkness, his cynicism, his desire for redemption. She reached out, her hand covering his. His hand was cold, trembling. She squeezed it gently, her touch a silent offering of comfort, of understanding, of forgiveness. It's over now, Callahan, she said, her voice soft. You're free. You're not that man anymore. Callahan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. Thank you, Eliza, he said, his voice husky. For listening.
For not judging me.
The sun had completely set. The canyon bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The stars began to appear, one by one, filling the vast expanse of the sky. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind. The broken oaths, the shattered dreams, the ghosts of the past, were still there, lingering in the shadows. But they were no longer as powerful, as menacing. They had been brought out into the open, exposed to the light, their power diminished by the sharing, by the understanding, by the love that was slowly, tentatively, blooming between them. The night was filled with a sense of peace, a sense of closure, a sense of hope. The echoes of betrayal still reverberated through the canyon, but they were fading, replaced by the faint, fragile melody of a new beginning. The canyon held its breath, the wind whispering a prayer of forgiveness, of healing, of redemption. Chapter 11. The Unforgiving Glare of Truth. The confession in Echo Canyon had cleared the air, but it had also stirred up a new set of anxieties. Eliza, while understanding Callahan's past, couldn't entirely shake off the unease of knowing the full extent of his involvement with Silas Blackwood and his gang. The name itself, Silas Blackwood, sent shivers down her spine. Callahan, relieved to have unburdened himself, was nonetheless acutely aware of the potential damage his confession might have done to their fragile relationship. He watched Eliza carefully, searching for any sign of rejection, of withdrawal, of fear. They returned to the ranch, the journey back subdued, reflective. The familiar sights and sounds of the McGraw homestead, usually a source of comfort to Eliza, now felt tainted by the shadow of Redemption's Edge and the lingering threat of Sheriff Thompson. A few days after their return, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch at a fast gallop. Eliza and Callahan, working in the corral, exchanged a look of apprehension. It wasn't Sheriff Thompson, but the rider was unfamiliar, his face grim, his demeanor urgent. He reined in his horse in a cloud of dust, his gaze sweeping over them. "You're Eliza McGraw?" he asked, his voice breathless. Eliza nodded, her heart pounding. "I have a message," the rider said. "From Redemption's Edge. From Silas Blackwood." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. Callahan stepped forward, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his hip. "What's the message?" Callahan asked, his voice cold and hard. The rider hesitated, his eyes darting between them.
He wants to see you," he said.
"Both of you. He says he has something that belongs to you." Eliza's mind raced. What could Blackwood possibly have that belonged to her? Her father's possessions had been meager, insignificant. The ranch was hers, legally, despite Thompson's threats. "He's lying," Callahan said, his voice filled with contempt. "He's trying to lure us into a trap." "Maybe," the rider said, his voice shaking slightly. "But he said to tell you it's about the past. About Echo Canyon." Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. The mention of Echo Canyon, the place where Callahan had confessed his darkest secrets, was a clear signal, a deliberate attempt to exploit their vulnerabilities. "We're not going," Eliza said, her voice firm, despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. "We have to," Callahan said, his voice low and resolute. He wouldn't have mentioned Echo Canyon unless it was important. He knows things. Things that could hurt us." Eliza looked at him, her eyes filled with apprehension. "What things, Callahan?" Callahan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Things I didn't tell you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Things I was too ashamed to admit." Eliza's heart sank. She had thought he had confessed everything, that he had laid bare his soul. But there was more, something deeper, something darker, something he had kept hidden even from her. "What things, Callahan?" she repeated, her voice trembling. Callahan's jaw tightened. "Things about the robbery," he said. "The stagecoach robbery. The one where the woman died." Eliza felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had known about the robbery, about the woman's death, but she had assumed it had been an accident, a tragic consequence of a plan gone wrong. "What about it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Callahan's eyes met hers, a flicker of pain, of guilt, of shame crossing his face. "I lied," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I wasn't just a bystander. I wasn't just a participant." He paused, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I was the one who fired the shot," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was the one who killed her." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Eliza felt the world tilt on its axis. She stared at Callahan, her eyes widening in disbelief, in horror, in betrayal. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "No, that's not possible." Callahan didn't answer. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, aching agony, a silent confirmation of the terrible truth. The unforgiving glare of the midday sun seemed to intensify, exposing the darkness, the lies, the broken oaths, the shattered dreams. Eliza felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She staggered back, her hand reaching out for support, for anything to hold on to in this moment of devastating revelation. Callahan reached out to her, but she recoiled, her eyes filled with tears, with anger, with despair. "Get away from me," she said, her voice trembling. Don't touch me." Callahan's face fell, his eyes clouding over with pain. He looked broken, defeated, lost. The rider, forgotten until now, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Blackwood," he said to tell you he'll be waiting, he said. At Echo Canyon. At sunset." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving Eliza and Callahan standing alone in the dust, the weight of the truth, the weight of the past, crushing them beneath its unforgiving glare. The ranch, once a symbol of hope, of a new beginning, now felt like a prison, a reminder of the lies, the betrayal, the blood that had been spilled. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of Eliza's sobs and the distant, mocking cry of a hawk. The truth, like the desert sun, was harsh, relentless, and impossible to escape. Chapter 12. A haven found in a bandit's arms. The revelation of Callahan's guilt shattered the fragile trust that had been building between Eliza and him. She felt betrayed, not only by his actions in the past but also by his lies, his omissions, his failure to fully confess his sins. She couldn't bear to look at him, to be near him, to even speak to him. She retreated into herself, spending her days wandering the ranch, her heart heavy with grief, with anger, with a profound sense of loss. The familiar landscapes, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock her, reminding her of the dreams she had dared to dream, the hopes she had dared to harbor, the love she had dared to feel. Callahan, devastated by Eliza's rejection, kept his distance, respecting her need for space, for time to process the devastating truth. He continued to work on the ranch, his efforts a silent penance, a desperate attempt to atone for his past, to prove his worth, to earn her forgiveness, even though he knew it was likely impossible. As the day of the meeting with Silas Blackwood approached, Eliza's anxiety grew. She knew she couldn't face him alone, but the thought of going with Callahan, of relying on the man who had killed an innocent woman, filled her with revulsion. She considered running, escaping, disappearing into the vast wilderness. But she knew it was futile. Blackwood would find her. He had resources, connections, power. And he had something she needed: answers. Answers about her father, about the debt, about Callahan. On the eve of the meeting, as Eliza was sitting alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, she heard a soft knock on the door. She hesitated, her heart pounding, then opened it cautiously. Standing there was a woman, a stranger, her face weathered and lined, but her eyes kind and compassionate. She was dressed in simple, practical clothes, a worn leather vest over a faded cotton shirt, a gun belt strapped around her waist. "Mrs. McGraw?" the woman asked, her voice soft, but firm. Eliza nodded, her heart filled with apprehension. "My name is Sarah," the woman said. "I know Bo Callahan. He sent me." Eliza's eyes widened in surprise. Callahan had sent someone?
But why?
"And who is this woman?" He's worried about you," Sarah continued. "He knows you're going to meet Blackwood. He knows you're angry with him. He asked me to help you." Eliza felt a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and a flicker of hope. "Why would he do that?"
she asked.
After everything?" Sarah's lips curved in a slight smile, a smile that held a hint of sadness. "Because he cares about you, Mrs. McGraw," she said. "More than you know. More than he probably realizes himself." She paused, her gaze searching Eliza's. "Bo, he's not a bad man," she said. "He's done bad things, yes. But he's also suffered. He's paid a price. He's trying to change." Eliza didn't know what to say. She was torn, conflicted, her heart aching with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a lingering tenderness for the man who had so profoundly wounded her. "I don't know if I can trust him," she said, her voice trembling. "I understand," Sarah said. "But trust me. I know Bo. I know his heart. And I know he would never let anything happen to you." She reached out, her hand touching Eliza's arm. Her touch was warm, reassuring, a silent offering of support, of solidarity, of friendship. "Come with me," Sarah said. "I have a place, a safe place, where we can prepare, where we can plan, where we can face Blackwood together." Eliza hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't know this woman. She didn't know if she could trust her. But she also knew that she couldn't face Blackwood alone. And she knew, deep down, that Callahan, despite his past, despite his lies, despite everything, still cared about her. He wouldn't have sent Sarah if he didn't. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "All right," she said. "I'll go with you." Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes.
"Good," she said.
"Let's go." They rode through the night, the darkness a comforting cloak, hiding them from prying eyes, from the dangers that lurked in the shadows. They reached their destination just before dawn, a small, secluded cabin hidden in a remote canyon, far from Redemption's edge, far from the ranch, far from Callahan. It was a haven, a sanctuary, a place where Eliza could finally breathe, finally think, finally feel safe. And in the arms of this unexpected ally, this woman sent by the man she had loved and lost, she found a measure of comfort, a glimmer of hope, a strength she didn't know she possessed. The bandits' arms, once a symbol of fear and betrayal, had become, through Sarah, a source of unexpected refuge, a testament to the complex, contradictory nature of human relationships, of love, of loss, of redemption. Chapter 13. Scars of the Past, Flames of the Future. Sarah's cabin was a small, rustic structure, built of rough-hewn logs and nestled amongst towering pines and aspens. It was a place of simple comfort, of quiet solitude, a refuge from the harsh realities of the outside world. Inside, a fire crackled merrily in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the sparsely furnished room. The scent of pine needles and wood smoke filled the air, a soothing balm to Eliza's frayed nerves. Sarah proved to be a resourceful and capable companion. She was skilled in the ways of the frontier, adept at hunting, tracking, and self-defense. She was also a good listener, a compassionate confidant, a woman who understood the complexities of love, loss, and betrayal. Over the next few days, as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Silas Blackwood, Sarah shared her own story, a story that resonated with Eliza's in unexpected ways. Sarah had been a member of Blackwood's gang years ago. She'd been young, naive, drawn to the thrill of adventure, the promise of freedom, the allure of easy money. She'd fallen in love with Blackwood, believing his lies, his promises, his charm. He was a charismatic man, Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of bitterness and regret. He could make you believe anything. He could make you do anything. She'd participated in the robberies, the rustling, the violence. She'd witnessed firsthand Blackwood's cruelty, his ruthlessness, his madness. She'd seen him kill innocent people, betray his own men, destroy lives without a second thought. "I eventually realized I was on the wrong side," Sarah said. "I couldn't stomach it anymore. I couldn't live with the guilt, the shame, the blood on my hands." She tried to leave, but Blackwood wouldn't let her go. He'd threatened her, hunted her, tried to kill her. She'd escaped, barely, with the help of Callahan. "He saved my life," Sarah said, her voice filled with gratitude. "He risked everything to help me get away. He gave me a second chance." Eliza listened, her heart aching for Sarah, for the pain she had endured, for the courage she had shown. She also felt a renewed sense of respect for Callahan, a confirmation of the goodness that she had glimpsed in him, the goodness that had been buried beneath layers of guilt and shame. "He told me about you," Sarah said, her gaze meeting Eliza's.
"He told me about the debt."
"About the agreement. About the ranch." She paused, her eyes filled with compassion. "He also told me about the stagecoach," she said. "About the woman. About his guilt." Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. She nodded, unable to speak. "He's been carrying that burden for a long time, Eliza," Sarah said. It's eaten away at him. It's made him who he is." She reached out, her hand covering Eliza's. "He needs you, Eliza," she said. "He needs your forgiveness. He needs your love." Eliza felt tears welling up in her eyes. She knew Sarah was right. She knew that Callahan was a changed man, that he was trying to atone for his past, that he deserved a second chance. But she also knew that forgiveness was not easy. It was a process, a journey, a leap of faith. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to take that leap. I don't know if I can," she said, her voice trembling. Sarah squeezed her hand gently. "You can," she said. "I know you can. You're a strong woman, Eliza. You've been through so much. You've survived. You've thrived." She smiled, a warm, encouraging smile. "And you're not alone," she said. "I'm here for you. We'll face Blackwood together. And we'll get through this." As the day of the meeting approached, Sarah helped Eliza prepare, both physically and mentally. They practiced shooting, riding, and self-defense. They discussed strategies, plans, and contingencies. They talked about Blackwood, about his weaknesses, about his power. They also talked about Callahan, about his past, about his present, about his future. And as they talked, Eliza began to see him in a new light, not as the man who had killed an innocent woman, but as the man who had saved Sarah's life, the man who had risked everything to help her escape, the man who was now trying to protect her, to help her, to love her. The scars of the past were still there, etched deep into their souls. But the flames of the future, fueled by courage, by hope, by forgiveness, were beginning to burn brighter, stronger, more enduring. The haven in the canyon had provided not just shelter, but also healing, understanding, and a renewed sense of purpose. Eliza, with Sarah's help, was ready to face Blackwood, to face her fears, to face her future. And she knew, deep down, that whatever happened, she would not be alone. She had Sarah. And perhaps she still had Callahan. The air crackled with anticipation, with fear, but also with a newfound determination, a strength born of shared pain, shared hope, and a shared love. Chapter 14. Riding through the heart of danger. The journey to Echo Canyon was fraught with tension. Eliza and Sarah rode in silence, their senses on high alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. The landscape, once familiar and comforting to Eliza, now felt menacing, filled with hidden dangers, with the ghosts of the past. Sarah, with her experience in Blackwood's gang, knew the terrain well. She guided them along hidden trails, avoiding the main roads, minimizing the risk of detection. She was a calm, steady presence, her confidence reassuring Eliza, bolstering her courage, helping her to quell the fear that gnawed at her insides. As they neared the canyon, Eliza's thoughts turned to Callahan. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, if he was safe. She felt a pang of regret, a longing for his presence, for his strength, for his love. She had pushed him away, rejected him, condemned him. But now, facing the prospect of confronting Blackwood, she realized that she needed him, that she still cared for him. She had forgiven him, in her heart. She understood his past, his mistakes, his humanity. She knew that he was not a monster, that he was a good man who had done bad things, that he was trying to change, to atone, to redeem himself. She also knew that she loved him. It was a love born of shared hardship, of mutual respect, of a deep, abiding connection that transcended the pain, the betrayal, the blood that had been spilled. As they entered the canyon, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the rugged landscape. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind and the beating of their hearts. They reached the designated meeting place, a large, flat clearing surrounded by towering rock formations. There was no sign of Blackwood, no sign of anyone. The silence was unnerving, the tension palpable. "He's late," Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's playing with us," Sarah said, her voice grim. "He likes to control the situation, to make us sweat." They waited, their hands hovering near their guns, their eyes scanning the shadows, their ears straining for any sound. The minutes stretched into an eternity, the suspense building with each passing moment. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the canyon, a voice that Eliza recognized instantly, a voice that sent a shiver down her spine. Well, the voice said. "Look who's here." The grieving widow and the runaway bride. Eliza and Sarah turned towards the sound, their guns drawn. Standing on a rocky ledge above them was Silas Blackwood, a tall, imposing figure with a cruel smile and eyes that glittered with malice. He was flanked by several of his men, all armed and dangerous. Welcome to Echo Canyon, Blackwood said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I've been expecting you. Eliza felt a surge of anger, of defiance. What do you want, Blackwood? She asked, her voice firm, despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. Blackwood chuckled, a sound that held no humor.
I want what's mine, he said.
I want what your father owed me. I want what Callahan took from me. He paused, his gaze lingering on Eliza. And I want you, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Eliza felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She knew that she was in grave danger, that she was facing a ruthless, merciless enemy, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had Sarah by her side, a skilled fighter, a loyal friend, a woman who had faced Blackwood before and survived. And she had Callahan, somewhere out there, in the shadows, watching, waiting, ready to protect her. She felt his presence, a silent promise, a source of strength, of courage, of hope. You'll never get what you want, Blackwood, Eliza said, her voice strong, resolute. You'll never have me. You'll never have the ranch. You'll never win. Blackwood's smile widened, a cruel, menacing grin. We'll see about that, he said. And with that, he raised his hand, a signal to his men. The canyon erupted in a hail of gunfire, the echoes reverberating through the rocks, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of horses, the shouts of men. Eliza and Sarah dove for cover, returning fire, their hearts pounding, their adrenaline surging. The battle had begun. The heart of danger pulsed with violence, with fear, with the desperate fight for survival. And amidst the chaos, amidst the bullets, amidst the blood, Eliza rode through, not just for herself, but for Sarah, for Callahan, for the future they might, just might, be able to build together. Chapter 15. The Weight of Loyalty, the Burden of Love. The gunfight in Echo Canyon was a chaotic, brutal affair. Eliza and Sarah, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a fierce determination, their training and their desperation driving them on. They moved from cover to cover, returning fire, their shots finding their marks, but Blackwood's men were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. Eliza, despite her fear, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She fought with a cold fury, fueled by her anger at Blackwood, by her determination to protect her home, by her love for Callahan. Sarah, with her experience in Blackwood's gang, was a formidable opponent. She moved with a deadly grace, her shots precise and lethal, her knowledge of the terrain giving them a slight advantage. But even she was struggling against the overwhelming odds. As the battle raged, Eliza saw one of Blackwood's men sneaking up behind Sarah, his gun aimed, ready to fire. Without hesitation, Eliza raised her rifle and shot him, the bullet hitting its mark, saving Sarah's life. Sarah turned, her eyes meeting Eliza's, a look of gratitude, of respect, of camaraderie passing between them. They were in this together, bound by loyalty, by friendship, by a shared purpose. Suddenly, a new sound joined the cacophony of the gunfight, a sound that Eliza recognized instantly, a sound that sent a surge of hope through her heart, the thunder of hooves, the roar of a familiar voice. Callahan. He rode into the clearing, his horse rearing, his guns blazing, his face a mask of fury, of determination, of love. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of destruction, his presence turning the tide of the battle. He shot with a deadly accuracy, his bullets finding their marks, Blackwood's men falling before him like wheat before a scythe. He moved with a reckless abandon, a disregard for his own safety, his only focus on protecting Eliza, on defeating Blackwood, on ending this, once and for all. Eliza and Sarah, emboldened by Callahan's arrival, fought with renewed vigor, their shots joining his, their combined force pushing Blackwood's men back, forcing them to retreat. Blackwood, seeing his advantage slipping away, his men falling around him, his plans crumbling before his eyes, turned his attention to Callahan, his eyes filled with hatred, with rage, with fear. You, he roared, his voice echoing through the canyon. "You always were a thorn in my side. I should have killed you when I had the chance." "It's over, Blackwood," Callahan shouted back, his voice cold and hard. "It's time to pay for your sins." They faced each other, two men locked in a deadly duel, their pasts intertwined, their futures uncertain, their fates hanging in the balance. The air crackled with tension, with anticipation, with the inevitable clash of good and evil. Blackwood fired first, his bullet whizzing past Callahan's head, missing him by inches. Callahan returned fire, his shot hitting Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him around, knocking him to the ground. Callahan stood over him, his gun aimed at Blackwood's head, his finger on the trigger, his eyes filled with a cold, hard fury. He could end it now, he could kill him, he could finally get his revenge, he could be free. But then, he looked at Eliza, her face pale and streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes filled with something else. With compassion, with understanding, with love. He lowered his gun, his hand trembling. He couldn't do it. He couldn't kill him, not in cold blood. He wasn't Blackwood. He wasn't a murderer.
He was a better man.
"It's over, Blackwood," he said, his voice low and weary. "You're finished." Blackwood, his face contorted with pain and hatred, glared at Callahan. "You may have won this battle," he spat, his voice weak and raspy. "But you'll never win the war. You'll never escape your past. You'll never be free." Callahan didn't answer. He simply turned and walked towards Eliza, his heart heavy with the weight of loyalty, with the burden of love, with the hope of a future that he had almost thrown away, a future that he was now determined to fight for, to earn, to deserve. The canyon echoed with the silence of defeat, the cries of the wounded, and the soft, gentle sobs of relief. The battle was over, but the war, the internal struggle, the journey towards redemption, was just beginning. Chapter 16. Whispers of Conspiracy, a Town Divided. With Blackwood captured and his gang dispersed, a semblance of peace returned to the ranch. However, the echoes of the gunfight lingered, a constant reminder of the dangers that still lurked, particularly in the form of Sheriff Thompson and the corrupt elements within Redemption's Edge. Callahan, despite his desire to settle down and focus on the ranch with Eliza, knew that they couldn't truly be safe until Thompson was dealt with. He'd heard whispers, rumors, of Thompson's involvement with Blackwood, of a conspiracy that reached deep into the town's power structure, a web of corruption that threatened to engulf them all. Eliza, still recovering from the emotional and physical toll of the battle, was hesitant to get involved in another conflict. She longed for peace, for normalcy, for a life free from fear and violence. But she also knew that Callahan was right, that they couldn't truly move forward until Thompson was brought to justice. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues, Callahan broached the subject. "We can't just ignore it, Eliza," he said, his voice low and serious. "Thompson's not going to let it go. He'll come after us, sooner or later. He'll find a way to take the ranch. To get rid of us." Eliza sighed, her heart heavy with a mixture of apprehension and resignation. "I know," she said. "But what can we do? We can't fight the whole town." "We don't have to," Callahan said. "There are good people in Redemption's Edge, people who are tired of Thompson's corruption, people who are afraid to speak out." He paused, his gaze meeting Eliza's.
"We need to find them," he said.
"We need to unite them. We need to expose Thompson's crimes. To bring him down." Eliza hesitated. It was a dangerous plan, a risky undertaking, a potential death sentence. But she also knew that it was the only way, the only chance they had to secure their future, to build a life together, to be free. "How do we do that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We start with Sarah," Callahan said. "She knows the town, she knows the people, she has connections." They decided to ride to Sarah's cabin, to seek her advice, to enlist her help, to start building a coalition, a force for change, a rebellion against Thompson's tyranny. When they arrived, they found Sarah waiting for them, her face grim, her demeanor urgent. "I've been expecting you,"
she said.
I've heard things. Whispers. Rumors. She paused, her gaze sweeping over them.
Thompson knows about the gunfight, she said.
He knows about Blackwood's capture. He knows about Callahan's involvement. Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. What's he going to do?
She asked.
He's planning something, Sarah said. Something big. Something dangerous. She hesitated, her eyes filled with apprehension. I heard he's hired mercenaries, she said. Gunfighters. Killers. He's going to attack the ranch. He's going to wipe you out. Eliza's heart sank. This was worse than she had feared. She looked at Callahan, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. We have to warn the others, she said. We have to prepare. We have to fight. We will, Callahan said, his voice firm, resolute. But we need allies. We need proof. We need evidence of Thompson's crimes. Sarah nodded.
I know someone, she said.
Someone who might be able to help. Someone who knows things. Someone who hates Thompson. She paused, her gaze meeting Eliza's. His name is Jedediah, she said. He's the town drunk. But he used to be a lawyer. A good one. Before Thompson ruined him. Eliza and Callahan exchanged a look. A drunk lawyer? It seemed like a long shot, a desperate gamble. But they had no other options. They had to try. They rode back to Redemption's Edge, the town a shadowy silhouette against the darkening sky. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with the whispers of conspiracy, the murmurs of dissent, the growing unrest that threatened to explode into violence. The town was divided, split between those who supported Thompson and those who longed for justice, for freedom, for a better future. And in the midst of this brewing storm, Eliza, Callahan, and Sarah sought to ignite a spark, a flame of rebellion, a hope for change. The whispers were growing louder, the tension was building, and the confrontation, the inevitable showdown, was drawing near. Chapter 17. A showdown under the desert moon. Jedediah, the town drunk, proved to be a surprisingly valuable ally. Despite his outward appearance of a broken, defeated man, he possessed a sharp mind, a keen memory, and a deep-seated hatred for Sheriff Thompson. He'd been a successful lawyer in Redemption's Edge until Thompson, fearing his influence and his integrity, had framed him for a crime he didn't commit, stripping him of his license, his reputation, and his dignity. Jedediah had kept meticulous records, hidden away, documenting Thompson's corrupt dealings, his illegal activities, his crimes. He had evidence of bribery, extortion, land grabs, even murder. With Jedediah's help, Eliza, Callahan, and Sarah began to gather support, secretly contacting the honest citizens of Redemption's Edge, people who were tired of Thompson's tyranny, people who were willing to fight for justice. It was a slow, painstaking process, fraught with danger, with the constant threat of discovery, of betrayal, of death. They held secret meetings in the dead of night, in abandoned buildings, in hidden cellars, and in the shadows. They shared information, planned strategies, built alliances, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Meanwhile, Thompson, aware of the growing unrest, of the whispers of rebellion, of Callahan's return, was also preparing. He'd hired his mercenaries, gunfighters from across the territory, men with no scruples, no morals, no mercy. He'd fortified the town, turning it into a fortress, ready to crush any opposition, to maintain his grip on power. The tension in Redemption's Edge was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket of fear and anticipation. The town was a powder keg, ready to explode, waiting for the spark, the trigger, the inevitable showdown. As the day of the planned confrontation approached, Eliza found herself torn between her desire for peace and her commitment to justice, between her fear of violence and her love for Callahan. She knew that this was a fight they couldn't avoid, a battle they had to win, a stand they had to make. On the eve of the showdown, as she and Callahan were standing on the porch of the ranch, watching the full moon rise over the desert landscape, Eliza spoke her fears. "I'm scared, Callahan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to lose you." I don't want it to lose everything. Callahan reached out, his hand taking hers. His touch was warm, reassuring, a silent promise of love, of loyalty, of protection. We'll get through this, Eliza, he said, his voice firm, resolute. Together. We'll win. We'll build our future. We'll be free. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. Eliza rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the warmth of his body, the strength of his embrace. I love you, Eliza, Callahan whispered, his voice husky with emotion. I love you more than anything in this world. Eliza looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, with love, with hope. I love you too, Callahan, she said, her voice barely a whisper. They kissed, a long, passionate kiss, a seal of their love, a promise of their future, a defiance of the darkness that threatened to engulf them. The next morning, under the pale light of the desert moon, they rode into Redemption's Edge, leading a small army of determined citizens, armed with rifles, shotguns, and the unwavering belief in justice. They met Thompson and his mercenaries in the town square, a dusty, desolate space that had witnessed countless acts of violence, of injustice, of despair. The two sides faced each other, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife, the silence deafening, the air crackling with anticipation. It's over, Thompson, Callahan shouted, his voice echoing through the square. Your reign of terror is finished. Surrender now, and you might live. Thompson laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. You think you can defeat me, Callahan?
He sneered.
You and your ragtag army of farmers and shopkeepers? He raised his hand, a signal to his mercenaries. Kill them all, he roared. The square erupted in a hail of gunfire, the echoes reverberating through the town, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of the wounded, the cries of the dying. The showdown had begun. The desert moon, a silent witness, watched as the battle raged, as good and evil clashed, as the fate of Redemption's Edge and the future of Eliza and Callahan hung in the balance. Chapter 18. Blood spilled, a reckoning at hand. The gunfight in Redemption's Edge was a brutal, chaotic melee. The townsfolk, fueled by years of pent-up anger and a desperate desire for justice, fought with a surprising ferocity, their numbers and their determination making up for their lack of experience. Callahan, with his skills and his knowledge of combat, led the charge, his presence a beacon of hope, a rallying point for the beleaguered citizens. Eliza, fighting alongside Sarah, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She fired her rifle with a steady hand, her aim true, her heart filled with a cold fury, a righteous anger at Thompson and his mercenaries, at the injustice they represented, at the threat they posed to her future, to her love, to everything she held dear. Sarah, a whirlwind of motion, moved through the fray with a deadly grace, her guns blazing, her experience and her skill proving invaluable. She fought with a fierce loyalty, a determination to protect Eliza, to help Callahan, to atone for her own past sins. Jedediah, despite his age and his weakened condition, played a crucial role, using his knowledge of the town's layout, his understanding of Thompson's tactics, and his sharp mind to guide the citizens, to coordinate their efforts, to turn the tide of the battle. As the fight raged, Thompson's mercenaries, despite their superior training and their ruthless tactics, began to falter, their numbers dwindling, their morale breaking, their confidence shattered by the unexpected resistance of the townsfolk. Thompson, seeing his carefully laid plans unraveling, his power slipping away, his empire crumbling before his eyes, flew into a rage. He fought with a desperate, reckless abandon, his cruelty and his ruthlessness amplified by his fear. He targeted Callahan, his hatred, his envy, his desire for revenge focusing on the man who had defied him, the man who had exposed him, the man who had stolen Eliza's heart. You'll die, Callahan, he roared, his voice hoarse with fury. You'll die for what you've done. He fired his gun, the bullet narrowly missing Callahan, grazing his arm, drawing blood. Callahan stumbled, but he didn't fall. He raised his own gun, his eyes locked on Thompson, his finger on the trigger, his heart filled with a cold, hard determination. But before he could fire, Eliza stepped in front of him, shielding him with her body, her rifle aimed at Thompson, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering love.
No, Callahan,
She shouted. Don't do it. Don't become like him. Don't lose yourself. Callahan hesitated, his hand trembling, his heart torn between his desire for revenge and his love for Eliza. He looked at her unwavering gaze, at her courageous stance, at her unwavering belief in him. He lowered his gun, his anger subsiding, his soul cleansed by her love, by her faith, by her forgiveness. It's over, Thompson, he said, his voice low and weary. Surrender now. It's finished. Thompson, seeing the resolve in Callahan's eyes, seeing the determination in Eliza's face, seeing the united front of the townsfolk, knew that he was defeated. His mercenaries were dead or captured, his power was gone, his reign of terror was over. He dropped his gun, his shoulders slumping, his spirit broken. He surrendered, not with grace, not with dignity, but with the whimpering fear of a cornered animal. The gunfight ended, the silence deafening, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder, with the scent of blood, with the aftermath of violence. The townsfolk, exhausted but victorious, cheered, their voices echoing through the square. Their relief palpable. They had won. They had defeated Thompson. They had reclaimed their town. Eliza rushed to Callahan, her arms wrapping around him, holding him tight, her tears flowing freely, her heart overflowing with love, with relief, with gratitude. You're alive, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. You're safe. Callahan held her close, his body trembling, his heart filled with a profound sense of peace, of closure, of redemption. We did it, Eliza, he said, his voice husky with emotion. We won. We're free. The blood spilled in Redemption's Edge had washed away the stain of corruption, the stain of injustice, the stain of the past. The reckoning had come, the balance had been restored, and a new dawn was breaking, a dawn of hope, of freedom, of love. Chapter 19. The Dawn After the Storm, A New Beginning. With Thompson's arrest and the dismantling of his corrupt regime, Redemption's Edge began a slow, arduous process of healing and rebuilding. The townsfolk, united by their shared struggle and their hard-won victory, worked together to establish a new order, a system based on justice, fairness, and respect for the law. Jedediah, his reputation restored, his legal skills once again valued, was elected as the new sheriff, a position he accepted with a mixture of humility and determination. He vowed to uphold the law, to protect the innocent, to ensure that Redemption's Edge would never again fall prey to tyranny and corruption. Sarah, having found a measure of peace and redemption in her role in the fight against Thompson, decided to stay in Redemption's Edge, offering her skills and her experience to help Jedediah maintain order and build a better future. Eliza and Callahan returned to the ranch, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a profound sense of hope. The scars of the past were still there, etched deep into their souls, but they were no longer defining them, no longer controlling them, no longer holding them back. They worked together, side by side, to rebuild the ranch, to restore it to its former glory, to make it a symbol of their love, their resilience, their new beginning. They mended fences, repaired buildings, tended to the livestock, and planted seeds, both literal and metaphorical, seeds of hope, of prosperity, of a future filled with promise. The ranch, once a source of conflict, a symbol of debt, a battleground for survival, became a haven, a sanctuary, a testament to their enduring love. They shared meals, laughter, stories, and dreams of a life together, a life free from fear, a life filled with peace, with joy, with the simple pleasures of everyday existence. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, Watching the sunset paint the sky in breathtaking hues of orange, purple, and red, Callahan turned to Eliza, his eyes filled with a love that was both tender and profound. "Eliza," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you. I know I've caused you pain." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "But I want to spend the rest of my life making it up to you," he said. "I wanted to build a life with you. I wanted to grow old with you. I wanted to love you, always and forever." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple, but beautiful, ring, a ring that had belonged to his mother, a ring that symbolized his love, his commitment, his unwavering devotion. "Eliza McGraw," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" Eliza's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of a love that had endured, that had overcome, that had triumphed over adversity. "Yes, Callahan," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will. I love you." Callahan slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling, his heart overflowing with happiness. They kissed, a long, passionate kiss, a seal of their love, a promise of their future, a celebration of their new beginning. The dawn after the storm had arrived, bringing with it a sense of peace, a sense of hope, a sense of renewal. The ranch, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, seemed to glow with a newfound beauty, a newfound promise, a newfound love. And as Eliza and Callahan stood there, hand in hand, their hearts intertwined, their futures intertwined, they knew that they had found, not just a new beginning, but a love that would last a lifetime, a love that would endure, a love that would conquer all. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The wedding of Eliza McGraw and Beau Callahan was a simple, yet heartfelt affair, held under the vast, open sky of the ranch, with the rolling hills and distant mesas as their witnesses. The townsfolk of Redemption's Edge, grateful for their newfound freedom and for the couple who had helped them achieve it, attended in droves, their presence a testament to the unity and resilience of the community. Sarah, acting as Eliza's maid of honor, stood by her side, her eyes filled with a mixture of joy and bittersweet memories. Jedediah, officiating the ceremony as the town's new sheriff and justice of the peace, spoke with a solemn dignity, his words carrying the weight of his own redemption and the hope for a brighter future. Eliza, radiant in a simple, cream-colored dress, her weathered hands clasped tightly in Callahan's, felt a sense of peace and contentment she hadn't known was possible. The scars of the past, while still present, had faded, replaced by the warmth of Callahan's love, the support of her friends, and the promise of a future filled with hope. Callahan, looking at Eliza with a love that was both tender and fierce, felt a profound sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given, for the forgiveness he had received, for the woman who had stood by him, challenged him, and ultimately loved him. As they exchanged their vows, their voices clear and strong, their eyes locked in a gaze of unwavering commitment, the assembled guests erupted in cheers, their applause echoing through the vast landscape, a celebration of love, of courage, of the triumph of good over evil. The reception was a joyous occasion, filled with laughter, music, and dancing. The townsfolk, their spirits lifted by the newfound peace and the prospect of a brighter future, celebrated with an abandon that reflected their relief and their hope. Eliza and Callahan, surrounded by their friends and well-wishers, moved through the crowd, their hands clasped tightly, their smiles radiant, their hearts overflowing with happiness. As the evening drew to a close, and the guests began to depart, Eliza and Callahan found themselves alone on the porch of the ranch house, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. It's perfect," Eliza said, her voice soft and filled with contentment. Everything is perfect." Callahan nodded, his arm wrapping around her waist, drawing her close. "It is," he agreed. We did it, Eliza. We built our life. We found our peace. They stood there for a long moment, silent, content, their hearts filled with a love that was both profound and enduring. The past, with its pain, its betrayals, its bloodshed, was finally behind them. The future, while uncertain, was filled with promise, with hope, with the unwavering certainty of their love. But then, a flicker of movement in the distance caught Eliza's eye. A lone rider, approaching the ranch, his silhouette a dark, ominous shape against the starlit sky. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She felt a prickle of unease, a lingering fear from the past.
Who was that?
She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Callahan squinted, his eyes narrowing, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his hip. As the rider drew closer, his features became clearer, illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. It was a young man, barely more than a boy, his face pale and streaked with dirt, his clothes torn and dusty, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. He reined in his horse in front of the porch, his gaze sweeping over Eliza and Callahan. "Mr. Callahan?" he asked, his voice breathless and shaky. "Mrs. Mrs. Callahan?" Callahan nodded, his hand still on his gun. "What is it?" he asked, his voice cautious. "What do you want?" The young man swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously between them. I have a message," he said. From down south. From a man named Silas Blackwood, Jr. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. The name, the echo of the past, sent a shiver of fear down her spine. Blackwood was dead. She knew he was. But his son, what's the message? Callahan asked, his voice cold and hard. The young man hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. He says he's coming for you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He says he's going to avenge his father. He says he's going to finish what he started. The final confrontation, it seemed, was not between hearts and horizons, but between the past and the future, between vengeance and forgiveness, between hate and love. The horizon held not just the promise of a new life, but also the shadow of an old enemy, a final test of their love, their courage, their commitment to each other. Epilogue. The news of Silas Blackwood Jr.'s impending arrival cast a long shadow over the newfound peace of Eliza and Callahan's life. The joy of their wedding, the promise of their future together, was momentarily eclipsed by the threat of vengeance, by the lingering echoes of the past. But Eliza and Callahan were not the same people they had been when they first met. They had faced danger, betrayal, and loss. They had fought for their lives, for their love, for their freedom. They had emerged from the crucible of their experiences stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected than ever before. They did not cower in fear. They did not run. They did not surrender. Instead, they faced the threat with a quiet determination, a resolve born of their shared experiences, a commitment to protecting the life they had built together. They prepared, not with the frantic energy of desperate people, but with the calm efficiency of seasoned veterans. They checked their weapons, secured the ranch, and reached out to their friends in Redemption's Edge, alerting them to the potential danger. Jedediah, the new sheriff, responded immediately, promising his support and the assistance of the town's reformed law enforcement. Sarah, ever loyal and courageous, offered her skills and her experience, ready to stand by Eliza and Callahan's side, no matter the cost. The townsfolk, grateful for the peace and stability that Eliza and Callahan had helped to bring to their community, rallied around them, offering their assistance, their support, their unwavering loyalty. As they waited for Blackwood Jr.'s arrival, Eliza and Callahan spent their days working on the ranch, their hands busy, their hearts filled with a mixture of apprehension and an unwavering love. They spoke little of the impending threat, but their shared glances, their gentle touches, their silent communications spoke volumes. They were in this together, bound by a love that had been tested by fire, a love that had endured, a love that would not be broken. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the vast, open landscape, Eliza turned to Callahan, her eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. No matter what happens, Callahan, she said, her voice soft but firm, I wouldn't trade our life together for anything. I love you, and I am grateful for every moment we've shared. Callahan reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her weathered skin. I love you too, Eliza, he said, his voice husky with emotion. And I'll protect you. I'll protect our life. I'll face whatever comes, as long as I have you by my side. They kissed a long, tender kiss, a seal of their love, a promise of their future, a defiance of the darkness that threatened to engulf them. And then they waited. But Silas Blackwood Jr. never arrived. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still there was no sign of him, no word of his whereabouts, no indication that he was even still alive. Rumors eventually reached Redemption's Edge that he had been killed in a bar fight in Mexico, that he had been arrested for cattle rustling, that he had simply disappeared. Whatever the truth, it became clear that the threat was over, that the past had finally been laid to rest, that Eliza and Callahan were finally free. They continued to live on the ranch, their love deepening with each passing year, their bond strengthened by the trials they had overcome, by the life they had built together. They grew old together, their hands weathered and worn, their faces lined with the wrinkles of time, their hearts filled with a love that was as vast and enduring as the western sky. They watched the sun rise and set over the rolling hills. They tended to their livestock. They welcomed friends and neighbors into their home, and they lived each day to the fullest, grateful for the peace they had found, for the love that had sustained them. And as the years passed, the story of Eliza McGraw and Bo Callahan became a legend, a tale whispered around campfires, a testament to the power of love, of forgiveness, of redemption. A story of a debt paid in blood, a love forged in fire, and a future built on the ashes of the past. Their story, like the land itself, was enduring, a testament to the human spirit, to the power of love, to the beauty found even in the harshest of landscapes. The final horizon was not one of fear, but of peace, a golden sunset on a life well lived, a love well earned. The end.